All right, we're joining this week here the Weekly Word, the Professor Stephen Heins, as well as this week Thomas Shepstone's joining us, Shepstone Management Company. So before we get into the meat and the potatoes, let's start off by giving you a little bit of a plug. You know, we appreciate the time, we appreciate the great mind that you bring. So the least we can do is let people know how you make a few bucks out there.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm a consultant. I do a lot of planning and research work in various states, but primarily Pennsylvania and New York. Some in Maryland and some in various other states. But I do a lot of research activity, working with people who want to do things, want to develop properties, research markets, that sort of thing. I also do a lot of nitty-gritty work with mundane issues such as zoning and land use and those sorts of things. And got involved in this gas issue by virtue of being a landowner and negotiating some leases with a gas company.
All right, so let's just set the table a little bit here about the gas issue that you referenced at the end of your statement. So just from context and everything else like that, just kind of, a little bit beyond the elevator pitch, but not quite War and Peace. So somewhere in the middle about just kind of what's going on with the land, with the gas issue, if you would, please.
Sure. Well, what we've had is a shale revolution, and that shale revolution covers both oil and gas, of course. But and as you know from the Bakken, that it's been primarily oil. But in the rest of the country, it's been mostly gas, natural gas. And our area of the country lies above the Marcellus shale and the Utica shale. We're referred to quite often as the Appalachian Basin, and it's an area that has a tremendous reservoir of natural gas in shale formations. And about 10 years ago, two professors, one from SUNY New York and one from Penn State, basically authored a report where they documented in no uncertain terms the huge reserves that were potentially available from these shales, particularly the Marcellus shale. And as a result of that, some various companies, such as Range Resources, they were one of the first, started developing these resources and doing some exploratory drilling. The results were rather fantastic, and the shale revolution was launched. Prior to that, there had been some, just a couple of years earlier, there had been some in Texas, in that area, in the Barnett Shale. So they were a little bit ahead of us. But the Marcellus is the one that really put the shale revolution on the map and really exploded it into the big time. And we're right there. We're on the edge of it, in an area that right now can't be drilled because of some regulatory obstacles. But most of the Marcellus shale, with the exception of our one county and New York, and also New York State, and a small part of Maryland, can be drilled. And it's yielding just enormous quantities of natural gas to the point that the market has occasionally been glutted. So it's been a miracle. It's the miracle of hydraulic fracturing combined with horizontal drilling. The two things together, both of which have been done previously but had never really been combined, is what we're talking about. And it's just it's a miracle, an absolute miracle. It's changed gas pricing throughout the world. It's changed the whole energy situation. It's been a great disruptor, and you might say, in the sense that it's made things possible we never thought were possible before, including energy independence. We're now back on top. We're the king of the hill in terms of energy. So that's what's happened. That's what I mean by the gas situation.
Before we get into some other parts, I just wanted to follow up with that a little bit and just kind of see if I can pick your brain on something to do with the Bakken and the Marcellus. I actually wrote a column, or an actual article, got picked up by a number of magazines, called the Bakken Marcellus Disparity. And when the Bakken first came about, the shale revolution in the Bakken was amazing because they discovered the wet gas. And I think it was John Gibson from One Oak, the way he described it to me. Very basic terms, again, because, every single inch is completely specific when you're talking about oil and gas and everything else. But from a very broad brush, the wet gas up in the Bakken, you're talking 7 to 9 different gases. Down in Texas, you're talking maybe 3 to 5. Different Pentiums, all these different things. And with the Marcellus, it was a different thing. So early on in the Bakken, there was 2 or 3 major type gas plants that were getting the media hype and getting the politicians' attention and everything along. Badlands NGL comes to mind as one of them. And then they all backed away because the economics wasn't there. And I remember an interview I did with Lee Tillman, who's a CEO of, I want to say, was it Exxon? Not Exxon, but oh boy, escape it. It's one of the top companies, and he just kind of explained about how it's very difficult to ship a molecule of natural gas from America to, like, say, South America, for example. So it all came down to the price and whether people were paying for science projects and all these different things. So you mentioned several times the Marcellus was really the springboard in all this. So based on kind of what I just kind of laid out with the wet gas, the dry gas, the cost of things, explain a little bit further why the Marcellus is so special when it comes to natural gas.
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind immediately. One is the proximity to markets. I mean, the Marcellus is bumping. It's part of the Northeast, and it's bumping up against the urban Northeast, which is also a problem, of course, in terms of the politics of it. But putting the politics aside for a moment, the marketing of the Marcellus is very, very easy in the sense that there are pipelines that connect us directly to the New York City metropolitan area and to the other metro areas on the northeast coast. And those markets are, of course, the premier markets in the world in many respects. So you've got it right there, and the cost of shipping it by pipeline, we could use more pipelines, but we have some, and the cost of shipping it to New York City is enormously cheap compared to other regions. The second thing that comes to mind is the fact that the Marcellus shale, as you mentioned, is dry gas, whereas, let's say, the Utica, which is also part of the Appalachian Basin, but the Utica is more a combination of oil and gas, so you can get both there. It's what's referred to as wet gas, so there's some oil in it and some additional byproducts that you can produce. That's why the Shell cracker is out there in western Pennsylvania, things of that nature. But the dry gas has its own advantages, and most of the Marcellus is dry gas, and that dry gas doesn't always require much in the way of processing. You know, with wet gas, you've obviously got the process that get the wetness out of it. You can't sell wet gas; you have to sell dry gas. Many times, the gas from northeastern Pennsylvania, in particular, can be sold directly to New York City, which is a little over 100 miles away. You can ship it there without doing any processing whatsoever to it. I mean, you basically just compress, put it in the pipeline, compress it, and put it in the pipeline, and away you go. So that's the advantage dry gas has. Now, at certain times, the thing is flipped. There have been times over the last decade where the Utica was a little more valuable because of the extra oil in there and the extra value. But there are also times, and we're back in one of those right now, I think, where the dry gas is somewhat more valuable because of the lowered cost of production and processing. So it goes back and forth. There's room for both.
And by the way, Lee Tillman was with Marathon Oil, and I feel ridiculous that I couldn't remember that, so I do apologize. And let's transition now over to the professor. Stephen Heins here, I apologize. I just wanted to make sure I had Lee Tillman of Marathon Oil corrected because I kind of gapped it out a little bit. So, Heins, I apologize for interrupting there.
No problem. Anyway, Tom has not really started talking about the elephant in the room, if you will. And that is the Delaware River Basin, where he has been very much of an activist. And what makes the Delaware River Basin so interesting is that they prohibit any harvesting of shale. Have now, I think, Tom, 7 or 8 years?
That's correct. More than that, actually, a little bit.
and they're trying to codify it now in such a way that nobody can even think about doing it in the future. So there's a lot at stake, and Tom is one of the leaders, as I understand best. Jim Willis was on our show, Tom. I think I told you that before.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And he gave us a good perspective on some of the real battles going on right now, not so much the legal battle you're having in the Delaware River Basin, but it's battles over pipeline. Now, I couldn't help but notice you'd mentioned New York City, which, as I understand it, has cut into its emissions in an enormous way by bringing in shale from Pennsylvania, natural gas.
That's correct.
And yet the governor of the state is adamantly against any fracking, as is the mayor. Now, I guess I'm having a little trouble understanding Mayor de Blasio, given the fact that natural gas has made such a contribution to New York City, why he in fact is against it. Maybe you can explain it to me, Lucy.
Okay, I like that transition there. We're both showing our age, aren't we? But anyway, but it's a pretty easy explanation, really, when you think about it, and it boils down to the fact that New York is a very urban state. It's 2 to 1, probably more than that. It's probably 3 to 1, urban to rural in terms of voters. And whenever that happens, you get into a situation where you're dealing with a tremendous number of people who control the politics, who don't know a lot about the production of food, the production of energy, things of that nature. So you're dealing with urban voters who control everything, who are subject to demagoguery on those issues. They think the food is grown in the grocery store. They think the energy comes from touching the thermostat, and they have no. And this is not to criticize them as human beings. It's just a fact of their life. I mean, I don't know anything about how to get my way around the city properly. I mean, I'm like a lost sheep when I get down to the city and try to figure out how to get around. And that's the way they are. They do not understand real life. They do not understand food production. They do not understand energy production, and as a result, they're very easily demagogued. And I know you folks don't like to get too political here, so I won't. But I think what you're seeing is in the case of both the governor and particularly with the mayor, is a lot of demagoguery for the sake of votes. And New York City has been a humongous beneficiary of natural gas. It's been on a crash program over the last almost a decade, really. It started under Bloomberg when he was mayor of the city, where they switched from number 6 oil, which is rather heavy and dirty, to natural gas wherever they could. It basically made it a mandate for larger buildings. And as a result, they're using more natural gas than ever, and they brought down the smog and the pollution in the city, air pollution in the city, tremendously. You can see maps of it, how it's changed. And the lives that have been saved just as a result of lowered asthma and things of that nature are awesome. And of course they like to talk about climate change and all that, and I don't want to get into a debate on that today, but the point is, if you're really serious about climate change, well, then you would want to reduce emissions. And what's the fastest way to reduce emissions? Well, it's shifting away from heavy oil, from coal and things like that to natural gas. So no matter whether you're talking about real air pollution from sulfur dioxide and things of that nature, or whether you're talking about climate change, either way, natural gas is the solution, not the problem. It's the solution. And the facts bear that out, but nobody dares talk about the facts because it's easier to demagogue the issue. And so that's why we're in this political dilemma that we're in. We are dealing with a cultural divide that really can't be crossed. It comes down to, and it's sad, people often say, well, you've got to educate people. Well, you can't educate millions of people. Not at one time, anyway.
You can?
You can't. And maybe you disagree with me, but I don't. I think ultimately you sometimes have to beat them in court, and I think that's ultimately what will happen with this the whole DRBC matter. I don't think we're going to educate New York City folks to suddenly recognize that the natural gas is a good thing. I think we've got to beat them in court and let the facts speak for themselves over a long period of time. That's the way I see it.
Well,
Tom, we had Sue Mickley on, and she brought up a point I hadn't heard mentioned before, and that is New York State building and upgrading their turbines up at Niagara Falls, and then in some ways that has really allowed the whole state to become more complacent because you have so much hydroelectricity up there.
That's true. New York is very fortunate, you might say, in some respects, in that they have all this hydro. But for that hydro, their progress in terms of renewables would be infinitesimally small. But this is why you have to read their news releases very carefully, because the real answer is that they haven't accomplished much at all. They're using more natural gas all the time. But the fact that they have this big block of hydro energy available, which counts as renewable, they make themselves look good, and they're able to demagogue the issue more. The problem that they have over the long term, and this is again why I think our short-term strategy on all these things has to be legal, and in the long term the facts will take care of themselves. Is the fact that the renewables, the solar and wind, and I'm not necessarily against either one of those. I mean, I've been involved in wind projects myself, representing them. But the problem is that there's not enough money in the world to make them the primary provider. The subsidies are just too great. And the second problem is that they're not dispatchable sources of energy. So without a battery revolution, which of course everybody's always saying, it's like the flying car, right? It's always out there. 10 years from now we'll be in flying cars. Well, that's what they say about batteries. So 10 years from now we'll have all the battery storage we need. Well, I'll believe it when I see it. But they're not dispatchable sources of energy. So therefore, that means that you've still got to have natural gas backup. And if you create too much solar and wind, what you've done is you've essentially duplicated the entire system, and you've made the natural gas part of it uneconomical. But you still have to have it because you need dispatchable energy. And the third problem really has to do with the land impacts. Solar and wind projects are not particularly popular in neighborhoods where they're placed. I know it. I've had to stand up in front of an angry crowd in Delaware County, New York, several years ago, where a lot of Manhattanites had moved up there with second homes, and as soon as somebody proposed the possibility of a wind farm in this one town, they went nuts. They went wild, and I was hired by the county to come up and try to restore some peace, and I had to stand there in front of 200 people and screaming at me how terrible these windmills were. And it's the same thing. I'm representing a town right now in New York State where we've had 2 solar farms come in, and frankly, they weren't bad projects. I don't agree with them because they're subsidized, but put the subsidies aside. They weren't bad projects. The developer, had a reasonable plan, and the fact is that they were, with that reasonable plan, the town was in a position to approve it, and I had to guide it through. And who's opposing it? Who's opposing me? And who we have to fight back against? We have to fight back against the people who were against natural gas development, who had told us solar was the answer. They're the people who show up at the meetings and say, no, we love solar, but not here, not here.
Jason, I'm going to let you say something quickly here. Sorry. But I have to bring up Tom testified at hearings on behalf of the Delaware River Basin Committee. Is it 5 states or 3 states that are members?
There's 4 states in the DRBC and 1 federal government.
Anyway, Tom did a post yesterday, and apparently he's used to having himself called names, but
yes,
he was called another name. Now, it didn't sound all that bad to me. I won't even mention it.
Oh, you go ahead. You can say
The response, Tom, was, "Hey,
It was very entertaining, and you'll love this, guys. I mean, the woman who called me crapstone, I'll say it. The woman who called me this, she claimed, I have no idea whether she was or not, but she claimed to be a Cherokee Indian, and she went on with a long pitch about the Indians taking care of the landscape or something. I couldn't make head or tail of it, but I did catch the crapstone part, and I thought it was quite entertaining.
Well, here we are. We got the weekly word. We got Tom Crapstone, otherwise known as Shepstone, with us, and the professor Stephen Heins. We're talking a little bit about some natural gas, and I'm glad that we brought the conversation to where it is, because I wanted to ask you about the protesters and environmentalism and extremism and the silos that people have created because they're busy, so they're just living on social media, and then they only read what they want to read, and whether it's fake news or real news, all this different stuff. The elephant in the room is leadership. Now, what it boils down to is there are certain things. Now, keep in mind, I don't even think 50% of the population votes. So you've got basically 25% of the people choosing what direction the country is going to lead. Now, what I firmly believe right now is leaders need to reinvent themselves. The oil and gas industry came out the last 5 years and said, shale revolution made us reinvent our business plan. The newspapers have been forced. The media has been forced to reinvent their business plans. It is now time, and this is a big feature we're doing up here in the Bakken, is leaders need to reinvent themselves too, especially politicians, because, listen, politicians can say all day long it's not an industry. When you have a job for 30 years, that is an industry. So a lot of these politicians, it is an industry for them. So what we're saying is that they need to reinvent themselves. So let's take a look at natural gas for a second, because there are certain things that really shouldn't be involved in politics. And I firmly believe energy is one of those things, because people want the light switch on. People want to drive their cars, those types of things. But when we start talking about subsidies, and then we start talking about natural solar and wind and ethanol, we'll throw in there as well. And when we start talking about on the natural gas side of things, well, BNSF is investing a lot of their own money into liquid natural gas. So is Swift Transportation and Cummins. They're investing a lot of they're not getting subsidies. And you know what they're doing is they're taking care of a problem. And our problem right now is a good problem. We have an abundance of natural gas, and we have solutions at hand. So to me, it becomes very perplexing the way the leadership is doling out the subsidies, especially, and this is a nonpartisan issue. This is an energy issue. Energy doesn't care about politics at the end of the day. They don't care about gun control. They don't care about right to life. They don't care about tax code. They just care about whether they're going to take energy and convert it into its proper source. So let's take a look at natural gas. I think we're on a slippery slope is where I'm going. You said we don't want to talk politics. I agree. What we're talking about here is whether the leadership who is behind a lot of this needs to be reinvented. So how's that for a loaded question for you, sir?
Yeah, that is a very loaded question. I guess I may say it a little differently than you. I totally agree with the leadership, and I think that's a rather insightful comment. But it kind of ties into what I was saying earlier, Jason and Steve, that part of the problem in the industry has been to assume that people understand they're just about solving problems, to assume that the public just wants to be reassured that they're pursuing the highest objectives and so on and so forth. And this is why the industry, and I'm talking about the oil and gas industry generically now, the industry always has a preference for mushy PR news releases that say absolutely nothing. Like, we'll all, the classic thing, this and that company, we stand committed to the highest standard of production and environmental protection and, all this blather. And it's not that they don't mean it, but the problem is this isn't what motivates people today. You can't put out mushy crap that doesn't say anything. People want to get to the heart of the matter, and quite honestly, this is why we have a President Trump, whether you like him or not. I mean, he speaks plainly, and so the people are so eager for that kind of plain talk, and I just despise it when these companies try to brush off serious political obstacles by issuing a mushy news release. This isn't what you need to do. You need to come back hard with facts. You need to come back. You need to put it right in their face, and you've got to beat them politically. This isn't a matter of persuasion. This is you can't use soft sell. We're way past the age of soft sell. You've got to do a hard sell of the facts, and you've got to make people confront the reality. And this is what we tried to do the other night in the DRBC hearings, the first round. Because the situation we have is we've got the Delaware River Basin Commission is trying to impose a ban, and their rationale is, and of course it's total politics. There's no science behind it, but they've tried to invent some science by referring to some very speculative studies by New York, which were really phony, but that's another story. And they tried to refer to the EPA study by cherry-picking that study. And in fact, the people who know the EPA study in depth realize it was generally positive, and if anything, it documented there weren't really any serious problems. So they tried to make this into something that was a justification for a fracking ban in the Delaware because they want to do it politically, period, because they want to demagogue it. But the reality is that the same governing majority of the DRBC is also the governing majority of the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, the SRBC. And that governing majority is Pennsylvania, New York, and the federal government. The same three parties are the majority of both commissions, and they're side by side. And in the SRBC, they've already drilled thousands of wells, they've fracked thousands of wells, and the result is a report that they put out as late as September of last year, 2017, saying there's no discernible impact from gas drilling on the quality of the water resources of the basin. It's right there in black and white. The hard data shows there is no impact. Now, given their choice, the industry would respond by saying something to the effect that, again, the blather. They would come out and say, our record is good and we're committed to the highest standards, et cetera, et cetera. What you've got to do is you've got to throw it out in people's faces, which is what we did, to say, no, this is the report the SRBC came out with. You're being hypocritical. You can't, on one hand, with your one hand, say it hasn't caused, after 10 years and thousands of wells, it hasn't caused an impact on water quality, and on the other hand, pretend that it might, and therefore you're not going to allow it in a side-by-side situation. You can't do that. This is the way, this is what I would call leadership, Jason, Steve, is people being forthright and coming hard back at the facts, and making them unmistakably clear without the trimmings of the blather. And the politicians who try to demagogue this issue need to be confronted with the reality. They need to be challenged. They need to be challenged very hard to defend their position. And you cited the New York City situation. I mean, is there any better evidence than that of where we stand and the good that we're trying to do and the reality of the situation? And yet a lot of people would try to avoid that and just talk their way through, muddle their way through. We're long past the period where you can muddle through. This is a time for straight talk.
How about the muddling of different topics together? I mentioned earlier about it's almost become politicized, where you come at energy from an energy standpoint, but when other people or industry leaders or politicians start incorporating, like I mentioned, some of the other issues in there, how is it that they expect the other person to take the facts for what they are, and they're not some sort of slanted, agenda-sized facts? Do you understand my question on that?
Yeah, I do. I think I do. It was interesting. I was at an interview for a consulting job yesterday, and in the course of that discussion, one of the parties that was interviewing turned out to be an anti-gas person. Everybody else was pro-gas, but the anti-gas, he was a very nice fellow, and he just made it clear he didn't like it because he was in favor of clean water. And he did agree, however, that the citizens, that the landowners in Wayne County should be compensated. Okay, I didn't challenge him because I was in the middle of an interview. It's not exactly smart to challenge the guy interviewing you. But but if I was in a normal conversation with him, I would say, now, surely you realize that there's not enough compensation to do that. Nobody's going to do that. We're talking, billions and billions of dollars of compensation that is being lost to our landowners, and nobody's going to come up with that money. It's unaffordable. It's undoable. It isn't going to happen. Now, you know that. You understand that. You're a smart person. You grasp that. So what you're doing is you're running away from the issue. You're essentially trying to say, I just don't want it, but I do believe that they should have compensation. But then you're not willing to admit the compensation is not a reality, so you're left with the problem. This is what we need to do. We need to expose with people who are semi-reasonable to say your position is unsustainable. It's undefendable. You need to come to the table. We need to work together to negotiate this and find a way to do this that protects your values, which is clean water. And we're absolutely confident we can do that. And you need to be reasonable and recognize that you're evading the real question. You're evading it. You're not confronting it. And so this is what I mean by forcing the issue. Doesn't mean we have to get nasty, but it does mean that we need to be forthright. Straight talk, again, is my answer.
Well, and I think, Tom, first of all, I think without really defining our mission statement, Jason and I, really that's why we started this, the Weekly Word. And what we wanted to do is add some kind of a national framework. So thank you for joining us, Jim Willis and Sue Mickley, and we will get a couple people from Energy and Depth down out of Dallas and Colorado. And Jason has been doing the Bakken for 8 years right now. And one of the things that it really seems so strange that economic development gets lost. Somehow it is overwhelmed by this, knee-jerk reaction against dirtying the water. And it's just, it drives me a little crazy because there's no national organization that takes care of consumers. Now, states have, consumer, they actually pay to have people act as consumer advisors and control costs and all the other things. But on a national level, there is nobody you can go to in the federal government and say, what about all of the values my county or my state is losing by this artificial withholding of using the modern technology to do shale and natural gas and all of that. One last thought, not one last thought, but another thought really is that in some ways the hearing and the comment part of deliberation just is broken, Tom.
Yeah.
I mean, so whether it's the FCC, they got 23 million comments on what is essentially it's a made-up issue called net neutrality.
Yeah, that's right.
Open access was decided 15 years ago, and there's nothing that net neutrality is only really applies to cable anyway. It doesn't have anything to do with telephony or with wireless. But so I can't help but think the environmental groups have a great ground game. In fact, I was reading something this morning about tribes up in Vancouver, Native American tribes, who are acting together and who are fighting the American NGOs who are funding an initiative not to allow tankers to come to the shoreline and get liquid natural gas, etc., and take it over to other parts of the world. And so we have the DAPL, where it's almost like Dances with Wolves or something. It's this well, we got to protect Native Americans. And the truth is that, as Jason has pointed out, 23% of all the shale in North Dakota is owned by the tribes.
Sure. Well, I think you put your finger on two problems.
They are very indiscriminate on what they use, and they certainly, I hear everybody say, well, they're forgetting the science, and I'm thinking I can only think of one large group that's forgetting the science, and that's the environmental NGOs.
Well, you're putting your finger on two problems, I think. One is, you mentioned the NGOs. The outsized influence of these NGOs is just incredible, and it's something I guess I instinctively knew before, but didn't fully appreciate until I got into this issue as to just how these people work. I mean, the massive amounts of funding they throw at malcontents and special interest, little groups and stuff. For example, the Delaware Riverkeeper in our area, which is a very radical group and is very effective at what it does. I mean, in terms of fighting every oil and gas and frac every development initiative there is in the Delaware River Basin. They're funded by the William Penn Foundation, which made its money in chemicals, not just chemicals, but tanning chemicals, which originally, led to the widespread removal of forests in our area and that kind of things to generate those chemicals. And so what you're dealing with is the fourth generation, third and fourth, fifth generation trust funders who are trying to assuage their guilt by funding all these groups, and they have tremendous influence around the world, and they cause so many problems. We need a fundamental addressing of this situation. I think that I've come to the point where I don't think there should be tax exemption for any of these groups, and I think something has to change on that. It's terrible. The other situation I think that you put your finger on there is the fact that we're now in a political environment where it's all or none. This is the fragmentation of the polarization of our country, I've come to the point where I realize that there's just no hope of rationalizing with some people. You just got to beat them, and sadly, that's part of the problem. Okay, that we're all in that situation now. And we've trained. I've done a lot of zoning work over the years, and part of in retrospect, looking back on some of that, I realize I'm part of the problem in the sense I've trained a lot of people to expect that all they've got to do is stand up at a meeting, raise their hand, and they can stop something. That isn't the way the law was supposed to work. And we've just somehow entered into a situation. We've trained so many of our people to imagine that they have the power to just veto whatever their neighbor doesn't, or whatever their neighbor does. They can just merely say, "I don't like it," and that's it. And somehow we've got to fundamentally deal with that problem as well. That we've got to train people about public process and equal rights and negotiation and all those things that are supposed to be the way we do business. We've somehow forgotten all of that. It's awful.
Well, and it's the technology, Tom. It's the fact that you and I and Jason right now could send what are they called, ghost emails, or they have another expression for them.
Right,
we could literally create 100 or 2 or 3 million responses to, let's say, the initiative at the FCC or the EPA, or
sure.
So it's even gone, beyond a one vote, one person. It now is in the hands of technology. And people with what they consider a righteous cause, literally swamping this whole process of comments and having open hearings. By the way, Jason, I was going to go out and testify out in Pennsylvania in March until I realized they are only allowed to speak 3 minutes. I can't even pronounce my name and where I'm from in 3 minutes. But it's it seems so strange. And I can't speak for you, Jason. I'll let you talk in a second. But counties right next to each other. Almost mirror images of each other, and one does it, successfully. Sue Mickley has helped prove that general health and economic development go hand in hand, and yet you have this enormous battle. And it's got to be that they're bringing truckloads of people in from elsewhere.
Oh, sure. It happens all the time. I mean, we had at the hearings the other day. I mean, I can't tell you how many people were there from New Jersey. Now, granted, they're part of the Delaware River Basin, too. They have a right to be there, but they came up to our hearing from down south, came up north, and they dominated a large part of the hearing. And that's what happens. We've seen it over and over again. You're talking about people who generally have a lot of time on their hands and are committed, and so therefore they show up at multiple places. They'll travel, and it's like half cause will travel, that kind of a thing. So that's what we're up against. But I do think, on a more positive note, that ultimately the facts do prevail. But sadly, it takes sometimes it takes a generation or two. But ultimately, facts do prevail, and I think that's what will happen here. I think as we see more pipelines built and as we see other things happen, I do believe there'll be more acceptance over time. And one of the things I learned a long time ago is I used to be, when I was young and foolish, I used to read Time magazine faithfully, got it every week, and then what changed my mind and why I stopped subscribing, why I stopped reading it a long time ago at this point, was that I happened to, and I used to save them, and I started one day flipping through some that were, from a year ago or 2 years ago, and all of a sudden I realized, my God, they were so wrong. They were so wrong about everything. and I think that's, again, on a positive note, where we're probably headed on this. That at some point, people will have that awakening on some of these issues, and they'll realize, like the nuclear freeze. Remember that? And remember the acid rain. All those issues from way past are long forgotten now. They're long forgotten because at the end of the day, they couldn't pass the fact test.
Well, and Jason, by the way, Tom, one of the things, he's been right on target as far as I'm concerned, and he's been doing it. I'm not just talking about it, but doing it. I'm not going to go into too much on your background, Jason. I'm going to let you do that. But his instinct is to tell stories through people, and not a anecdote from nowhere, but something that has to do with communities and with individuals who are really aware of all of these things, including the importance of economic development. But he's really been telling the story of the Bakken through the people who have benefited from it.
Well, I'll even go a step further and tie in the climate change thing. That'll sum it up. Is I don't necessarily read what the politicians read. I read what the scientists put out, which means that I'm not getting something that's filtered and politicized. And so I never got into the catastrophic or the sensationalism about climate change. And one of the things that I've been vocal about in a political sense is climate change. I'm not, is there change? Yes, there is change. And if you go back all the way to the dawn of humans, you'll notice that the sun is very much connected to the planet. And if we understand the sun, we'll understand climate change. And I do agree with the great philosopher George Carlin that the humans are not going to do anything to the planet. The humans might go somewhere. The planet ain't going anywhere. So I think there's a lot of catastrophe, sensationalism. There's a lot of things that go into it to where I think a religion of environmentalism has been produced. And so anytime you got a religion involved, it's passion. There's a lot of passion. And then when I layer in the protesters, now you mentioned earlier these people have a lot of time on their hands. I pontificated this several weeks ago, and I continue to, which is back in the 60s, you didn't have a lot of debt. And so people protested because they actually cared about things. And so their passion was driven internally. It wasn't driven out of a mortgage payment. Today, you flash forward today, you have so much debt, whether it be student loans, mortgage payments. There's so many different reasons that people don't protest with what they're passionate about, for or against. Okay, for or against, for example. Let's say somebody's really for a pipeline. They're not going to go out and protest because they might get fired from their job if they're seen, and if they take a stance and all these different things. So debt has a major part to kind of saltpeter people's passion, if you will, when it comes to protesting. But there are people that make a darn good living traveling the country. We saw that firsthand with the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, that, yeah, you had some passionate people, no question about it. In fact, that was the original seed, was a legitimacy behind a conversation when it came to the environmental protection, when it came to water. Now, that is a very much a legitimate discussion. But when you start bringing in sensationalism, fear-mongering, and the religion of environmentalism, you can't have a rash conversation with anybody anymore. That is now done. What do you make about I call it the profession of a protester, based on just kind of what I said leading up, how the profession of the protester, in my opinion, has been created? You deal with a lot of these people. Are a lot of these people actually that passionate, or are they passionate about making sure their mortgage is being paid?
I think they're passionate about attention seeking. A lot of them, and the money is what allows them to do it. We see that a lot. I think of a young fellow who is, I think he's maybe just 30 at this point, but this fellow who's from our area. He appears at every possible event you can imagine. He sits up in trees at when pipelines are being constructed. He chains himself to a gate, when a new compressor station is being, the type, the whole thing. And he's I've met him different times, and as a matter of fact, I saw him at the hearing Tuesday night, and his father came over and introduced himself to me, and he was very nice too. But they're totally radical, and this kid has been doing this since he was in high school. He's been doing it, and then when he got in college, he went to a college in Pennsylvania, and on Eastern Pennsylvania, and twice. He managed to get himself arrested and as a leader of a protest in one time at NYU in New York City, and another time at the University of Pittsburgh, neither of which he attended. Okay, and he's leading the protest. So this is a kid who's just driven by the desire for attention and for the desire to be radical. Some people just want to be nonconformists, and he's one of those. He absolutely wants to be a nonconformist. He absolutely wants attention, and so and what he does is he gets away with this because he gets money from a tiny little group in Philadelphia called the Action Center Inc., which gets money from another group, which in turn gets money from the Rockefeller Foundation. And this is how it works. The Rockefeller Foundation is, or any number, there's like 7 or 8 different Rockefeller NGOs. They will give out money to XYZ group, which is somewhat radical, somewhat mainstream. It's kind of in the middle. And then that group will in turn give out money to a group that is thoroughly radical, okay, that is hiring somebody like this young fellow. And so he gets just enough money. He's not making a fortune at this, but he's making enough money that he can do this rather than get a real job. And that's what you see happening over and over and over again, is the exploitation of those people who seek attention and are willing to work for very little, as long as they don't have to get a real job and they can be professional protesters. And we see it all the time, and we see ads on Craigslist to hire these people temporarily sometimes.
Tom, I want to recount a story from a couple of years ago. Now, I used to belong to the NRDC, or at least I was very friendly with them until they sort of went off the rails on natural gas, until they went from anti-coal to anti-fossil fuel. But and the EDF, NRDC, Sierra Club, they are sitting on billions of dollars right now. But anyway,
Oh, yeah.
Sierra Club ran an ad out in California, advertising for 400 or 500 interns.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
And they were paying as much as $500 a week, and all these interns had to do was make cold calls to people throughout the United States and identify the people who believe in climate change, especially in extreme climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And needless to say, they did.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is how it happens, and we see it all the time. And the money for that comes from very wealthy families. It's always that way. And the Rockefellers are prime among those, but there's also a handful of other families. The Heins family has financed an awful lot of this stuff across the country, but particularly in certain areas. The Park Foundation, which is in Ithaca, New York, they had a communications empire at one time, and they also they owned some company and made cake mixes. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, they made a fortune with billboards, cake mixes, and things like that. And their heirs are huge funders of anti-gas, anti-oil stuff. And you have the Wallace family, which is descended from our socialist vice president, Henry Wallace, from way back when, one of Franklin Roosevelt's, I guess that was his third vice president, if I remember correctly. And there's a few others. What you do is when you dig into this and you investigate where the money comes from, you find it's from very wealthy elites, and they're very few in number. They really are, and they're investing money in disruption. That's what they're doing, and they have ulterior motives. It's a combination of assuaging their guilt, which is huge, and also, and I don't mean real guilt, but I mean their sense of guilt for having done so undeservedly well. And also, in the case of the Rockefellers and the NRDC gang, as I refer to them, they have huge land holdings in the Catskills of New York and various other places, and they want to enlarge those land holdings to make essentially the next Harriman Park, if you will, for themselves around their second homes. And part of their objective, very clearly, is to make a wilderness of certain areas so it's their playground. And in order to make a wilderness, you've got to reduce the land value to the point where it can be picked up for a song. And oil and gas is against that because oil and gas raises property values and makes it more difficult. This is at the heart of why so many of these groups are opposed to it. They're not opposed to it so much environmentally as they are because they know it involves a blue-collar culture, it involves rising property values, it involves capitalism, and these are all things that are antithetical to them, either politically or because it's contrary to their objectives of making a wilderness for their own playground. That's how I see it.
Well, and I think really I don't want to even say this, but I know a couple of the Rockefeller offsprings or great-grandchildren or whatever. I played golf. I played golf on the Rockefeller golf course.
Oh, well, I guess we're going to have to be careful here, Jason, who we're dealing with. Yeah,
yeah, no kidding.
They have what they call their playhouse, which is about 10,000 feet long. It has 4 bowling alleys. So, but here's really, it seems to me one of the reasons why the Rockefeller Foundation, they are good at seed money, and I think really that a lot of people who are, as Jim Willis earlier said, either young rebels or old rebels who have little hair on top and a ponytail.
Yeah, that's right.
who contribute. So on the one hand, you have this great accumulator of large moneyed families, but you also have a remarkable cash flow coming from ordinary people who believe the narrative.
All right. Well, Well, we better get wrapped up here. I see the clock here, so we better get into our closing statements here. We got weekly word here. I better reset everything, remind everybody that what we have going on here. It's a weekly word, and we're talking a little bit about natural gas. Tom Shepstone is our guest, along with the professor Stephen Heins. And so closing thoughts, guys, anything that we want to reiterate, anything that we left out, that sort of thing?
I would just say I think you did a great job. I can't recall being on a radio program where you got such good questions, to be honest with you. So I want to compliment you folks on the program that you developed and the way you're approaching it. And I think we actually got to the root of the matter in a much more in-depth way than frankly, I've ever experienced on this issue. So my compliments, my hats are off to you.
Well, thank you. I'm sure Jason feels the same way. We continue to want to follow what you're doing out in the Marcellus, really, Tom, because it says a lot. And from my point of view, I have appreciated your nuts and bolts, your affiliation with groups like Energy in Depth, who are literally providing the good information that is out there to battle the rumor mongering and the imminent cataclysm of the world itself. And so, Jason, I'm not going to speak for you, but I love these kind of conversations. There's no name calling. We didn't call you a name, Tom, just for the record, okay?
But you repeated one, Crapstone. You know, I mean.
I didn't repeat it. You said it, and then.
And by the way, I should have mentioned. Please check out my blog on this subject, naturalgasnow.org. So that's my final word.
Outstanding. Naturalgasnow.org. We'll have all the links, of course, available at thecrudelife.com. Well, Weekly Word concludes this week. For the Professor Stephen Heins, myself, Tom Shepstone. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Jason, thank you.